perfect human being. The pinnacle of man. Raw power. Gotcha.
In this video, we're gonna go over some practice problems. In this video, we're gonna go over
mutual induction. Make a coil with insulated conducting copper wire at one end of a soft iron core and connect its ends to a torch cell through a switch. Make another coil at the other end of the same soft iron core and connect the ends of the coil to a galvanometer. Of these, the circuit which is connected to the battery is called primary circuit, and that connected to the galvanometer is called secondary circuit. Here there is no interconnection between primary and secondary connections. When we switch on, the galvanometer deflects to one side and returns back to its main position. When we switch off, the galvanometer deflects to opposite direction and comes back to original position. Now repeat the experiment, connecting a 6-volt AC supply instead of the DC in the primary coil and 6-volt bulb instead of the galvanometer in the secondary. The bulb starts glowing continuously. How does it happen? When AC passes through a solenoid, a fluctuating magnetic field is produced around it. When the strength of the current in one of the two adjacent coils changes, a change takes place in the magnetic field around. As a result of this, an EMF is produced in the second coil. This phenomenon is mutual induction. The EMF produced due to mutual induction and the number of turns in the coil are interrelated. If we increase the number of coils in the secondary, the intensity of the bulb also will increase. If we cut down the number of turns into half, the intensity of the glow also decreases. From this, we can conclude that there is a relation between the EMF produced by mutual induction and number of turns.
Check out this cool YouTube video I found. Here's a coil that is connected to some power supply, so there'll be current running over here. But there's a second coil which is not connected to any power supply or any batteries. It is just connected to a bulb. Now look at what happens when he brings this closer to the first coil. It lights up, even though there is no connection between these two. Look at that. It lights up. Wow. How is that happening? Now, although it doesn't look so dramatic, if you think about it, we're having a wireless power transfer, electricity transfer from one coil to another. There is no connection between them. And the idea is the same in wireless charging phones. There's a wireless power transfer happening. So how is the electricity able to jump from one wire and enter into another wire when there is no contact? Well, let's find out. So here's the same setup. There is a current that's running through one of the coils. Let's call that as coil 1. And let's call that current I1. And everything related to this coil, let's keep it blue so that we can differentiate between the two coils. And so because of this, somehow the bulb is lighting up in the second coil. How is that happening? So let's think about this. We know now that the current in the first coil generates a magnetic field in the first coil. But what's important is that this current is changing. It's continuously changing its direction, its strength is changing, which means the magnetic field that it's producing is also changing, it's fluctuating. And we know from Faraday's law that a changing magnetic flux induces an EMF. And so what's going to happen, there are a couple of things that are going to happen. One thing that's going to happen is that this coil itself will oppose the change in the flux, and therefore we say that the coil itself opposes the change in its own current. This idea is what we call self-induction, because the opposition is happening to the same coil. So there's an EMF induced in this coil due to the change in its own current, self-induction. However, this time what's happening in this experiment is that this field generated by the first coil is also seen by the second coil. It's also linked with the second coil, as you can see. And therefore, if the field is changing, the flux through the second coil is also changing. Ooh, this means there will be an EMF induced in the second coil as well. So let's write that. There will be an EMF induced in the second coil. Due to what? Due to changing current in the first coil. This idea, where you have an EMF induced in one coil due to the changing current in the another coil, that's what we call mutual induction. And we'll get to know exactly why it's called mutual in a second, but that's the idea behind mutual induction. Hopefully you can differentiate between the two now. And because there's an EMF induced over here, there's a current that starts running over here. I have a battery connected to a bulb via a switch. I close the switch, the bulb glows. Open, bulb doesn't glow. Close, bulb glows. No surprise over there. But now let's attach a coil wrapped around some metal in series with the bulb and see what happens. Ready? 3, 2, 1, close. Ooh. Now we see the bulb takes some time to glow. Why is that? Well, let's find out. Wait, did you see that? Seriously, what is happening? So with the coil in series, we saw that when we close the switch, the bulb takes some time to glow to its full brightness. From this we can infer that the current takes some time to grow to its max value, the value given by Ohm's law. Maybe 1 ampere, let's say that's the maximum value. Which means the coil is for some reason delaying, it's slowing the rise of the current. But why is it doing that? Well, let's investigate. If we pause the animation over here, we know that there is some current running in the circuit. It's not maximum value yet, but there is some current. And that current is of course going through the coil. And we've seen when we have current circulating through some coil, it generates a magnetic field. We've seen this enough number of times now. Now what's interesting over here is that this current is increasing. Remember, we are not yet at the max value. We have paused the animation. The current is going to increase.
Am I stupid? Is the current not flowing all the way?
Which means the magnetic field that is produced over here also tends to increase. Ooh, this means the flux is increasing. And we know from Faraday's law that whenever there is a change in the flux, the coil will induce an EMF trying to oppose that change. So over here in this coil, there will be an EMF induced opposing that change in flux. Okay, that's a lot to take in. So let's slowly write this down. So what we're seeing at this moment is that there is a changing current. Let's call it DI or delta I. Because of that changing current, because current is producing magnetic field and there is a magnetic flux, there is a changing flux over here. The flux is changing. And we know from Faraday's law that that changing flux causes the coil to produce or induce an EMF, and that EMF always tends to oppose the change. Okay? So what does this all mean? Well, if we get rid of this middleman, then this basically means that
Yo ho, what? Check snap. Burp.
Whenever the current changes through a coil, the coil will produce an EMF trying to oppose the change. Which means if you try to increase the current through the coil, it will induce an EMF and tries to decrease it. If you try to decrease the current, it will induce an EMF and will try to increase it. Remember, the coil has no problems with the current itself. Once the current reaches the maximum value, the coil does not induce any EMF. The coil is happy. It's the change in the current that's where the problem lies. So whenever you try to change the current through any coil, it will induce an EMF and tries to oppose that change. And this ability to resist changing currents by inducing an EMF is often what we call inductance. And that's why coils are often called inductors. To be more precise, we should call it self-inductance, because the changing current and the opposition, they're both happening in the same coil. So the coil is sort of kind of like opposing itself. And that's why it's called self-inductance. So more inductance means more ability to resist the changes in the current. So it's kind of like an inertia. In fact, that's why inductance is often called electrical inertia, resistance to change. But change of what? Change of current. Now, before we get back to our story, let's think about how much EMF or how much voltage is this coil inducing due to the changes in the current. We can figure that out using Faraday's law. Faraday's law says that the induced EMF in any coil equals negative N d phi over dt, where phi represents the magnetic flux. You can call it d phi b over dt. This basically says that the induced EMF depends upon how quickly the flux changes. If the flux changes very quickly, a very high EMF is induced and it opposes the change in the flux. Now in our case, the flux is generated by the current. More current, more magnetic field, more flux. So we can say that in an inductor or in a coil, magnetic flux is proportional to current. So you know what we could do? We can write this to be equal to negative di over dt. We're basically saying the flux is changing because the current is changing, right? And it's proportional, so there should be some proportionality constant, and that constant we often like to call L. And that L represents the self-inductance. So this means if the current changes very quickly, the EMF induced is very high. If the current changes very slowly, EMF induced is very low. If the current doesn't change at all, no EMF is induced. And for a given change in current, or a given rate of change of current, notice the EMF would be high if the inductance is very high. So if the L value is huge, it means very, very high resistance to changes in the current, very high EMF induced. If the inductance value is low or zero, notice it doesn't matter whether the current changes or not, there will be no induced EMF. So this thing represents the inductance. And very quickly we can work out the units of the inductance. Feel free to pause and try figuring out yourself. So the unit of inductance becomes EMF, which is volt divided by amperes per second. Divided by amperes per second, and the second will come on the top. But we often like to write this Henry, named after Joseph Henry, who was another person who independently discovered electromagnetic induction. And just like capacitances or resistances, which only depend on their geometry and the material used, and it does not depend upon the current and the voltage, similarly, inductance also only depends on the geometry. It depends upon the number of turns, what is it turned around, the material used over here, but it does not depend upon voltages or currents. And in future videos, we'll see how to calculate the inductance of a coil or a solenoid, but it does not depend upon voltages or amperes. With that, now we can get back to our original experiment. So what happens the moment I close the switch? Well, the battery says, hey, I want to increase that current from 0 to 1 ampere as quickly as possible. So there is a di over dt coming. And the inductor says, I hate changes in current. And so it opposes that change. And the way it does that is it induces an EMF, or it produces a voltage. And since it's opposing the battery because it doesn't want the current to increase, the voltage comes this way with a plus on this side and the negative on this side, which opposes the current. But then the battery says, all right, okay, I will grow the current a little slowly. So di by dt reduces. And as a result, the induced EMF, the voltage induced, starts reducing. Now note very carefully, I did not say the current reduces. The current is 0 to begin with. How can it reduce? But di over dt, the rate at which the current is growing, that slows down. The battery basically says, okay, inductor, I will increase the current a little slower. So the inductor gets a little less mad. And as a result of that, now the current starts growing. And as the current keeps growing, the di over dt starts reducing more and more. I mean, becomes smaller and smaller. And as a result, this induced EMF starts becoming smaller and smaller. The opposition starts becoming smaller and smaller. And that's why the current can start becoming larger and larger. And that's why slowly and steadily the bulb starts glowing. And eventually, once it reaches that max value of 1 ampere, the current no longer changes. di over dt becomes 0. And once that happens, there is no longer an induced EMF. The inductor is happy because the current is not changing anymore. Remember, inductor has no problems with the current. It's the change in the current that the inductor has a problem with. Yes, I'll keep saying it until you get it, because this can be confusing. Okay, and I hope you agree that if the inductance value was very high, if this was a larger inductor, then it would take longer time for the current to rise to its maximum value because the opposition would be so much stronger. Okay, so now the current is running at its max value, no longer changing. The inductor has no longer any effect on the circuit. And now I try to open the switch. What do you think is going to happen? Based on what we learned, can you pause?
Like,
And ponder.
current won't flow, but there's a electromotive force going from here to here, so there's a I don't know.
Ponder upon this and think about what's going to happen if I open the switch now. Alright, let's do it together. Let's open that switch. So far the inductor was calm. The moment we open the switch, the battery gets disconnected from the bulb and the battery says, let's get the current back to 0. And the inductor goes wild. The inductor says, are you kidding me? I hate changes in current. Now, the di by dt is negative. The current is trying to reduce, and that too, it's an incredibly high value. The current is trying to go to 0 almost instantly. The inductor gets mad. The inductor induces a much higher EMF, but this time in the forward direction. Can you see that? Negative times negative becomes positive. So this time the inductor is trying to support the current. Remember, inductor never had a problem with current. It always has a problem with changes in the current. So the inductor tries to maintain the current. But wait, the circuit is broken. There is air in between. There's so much resistance. How can it do that? Well, it generates a huge EMF. A huge EMF is now coming. And as a result of that, it's trying to maintain that current. But wait, where would the charges go? The charges don't have anywhere to go. The circuit is broken. Because the inductor is pushing, the charges get accumulated over here. A lot of positive charge gets accumulated. A lot of negative charges will get accumulated over there. And eventually, there will be a spark. But the inductor can't maintain that. Eventually, di by dt goes to 0. This goes to 0 and the current dies off. That's the story. And during that last second when the inductor got really mad, the voltage that it generated was incredibly high. It can be hundreds or even thousands of volts. And therefore, it's incredibly dangerous to try and switch off a circuit where there are huge inductors involved. It can cause nasty sparks. And so that's the story of inductors. They hate changes in
Fuck.
Let's talk about magnetic field.
What's like Khan Academy India? Talking in English.
Let's talk about magnetic field energy. How much energy is stored in a magnetic field, and also let's derive an expression for that. And I'll also talk about why this concept is truly special. Alright, I want to keep the math simple, so let's start off with a familiar setup, and that of a charged inductor. Let's say that there is a current I flowing through this inductor. Now we can ask ourselves, what is the energy stored in this inductor? We have actually derived that expression, and the expression looks like this. The energy stored in the inductor is half into the self-inductance of this solenoid into I square, current square. We can also think about where is this energy really stored in the inductor. Why don't you pause the video and think about it? Alright, since we know that there is current flowing in the inductor and this is current flowing in the coils, it will produce a magnetic field, and the magnetic field would look like this. So the energy in an inductor is actually stored in the magnetic field within the coil. Just as the energy of a capacitor is stored in the electric field between the plates. Now because we are interested in figuring out the magnetic field energy, we need to bring in that factor somehow in this equation. So maybe pause the video and think about how we can include or insert the factor of magnetic field in this expression. Alright. We know that inductor is basically a solenoid and it has current going through it, so it produces its magnetic field lines. So this magnetic field line, this must have a strength of its own, and that could be a way of inserting the factor of B in our expression. Now magnetic field due to solenoid, this is given by this expression right here, mu naught n I divided by L. Here L is the length of the solenoid. Alright, so we can write I in terms of B and maybe put that here. But we also have this self-inductance, and we did learn one expression about self-inductance for a solenoid which looked like this, mu naught n square A divided by L. Now it has some common terms, it has L, it has N, so maybe in place of L, let's write this expression and see what we arrive at. But firstly, let's keep I on one side and everything is on the other side to figure out what can we substitute. Let's write current in the form of B, so this will be I equals to capital B into L divided by mu naught into N. So let's put in this I right over here, and let's put in this L, the self-inductance, right over here. That will make the energy as half into mu naught n square A divided by L and into I square. This is not just I, this is I square, so all of this gets squared, and when we do that, that becomes B square into L square divided by mu naught square into N square. Now we can see that couple of things get cancelled right away. This N square just gets cancelled, and 1 power of mu naught also goes away. 1 power of L also goes away. So let's rearrange this, and when we do that, this becomes half into B square divided by mu naught into A into L. Now A into L is nothing but the volume of this solenoid. This is the volume where the magnetic field is present in or residing in. One assumption goes here. That assumption is that we are assuming that the magnetic field is 0 outside the volume of the solenoid, or extremely weak outside the volume of the solenoid, and all the magnetic field that there is just inside the solenoid. We can think of this magnetic field energy as residing in the volume that is enclosed by the windings, which is AL. So this factor right here is the volume. And when we take this factor to the left hand side, what do we get? We get the magnetic field energy U divided by the volume. And this is equal to half into B square divided by mu naught. Now energy divided by volume, what can we call this? We used to write mass divided by volume, and that gives us density, that is the density of matter. Here energy divided by volume would be energy density. So this we can write this as energy density, and this is particularly magnetic field energy density, which is given by half into B square divided by mu naught. The units of this would be joules per meter cubed. And we have done something similar before, but for electric fields. So for that we used a capacitor, and we tried to figure out the energy of electric field.
Did I just eat 400 calories?
Which came out to be as epsilon naught E
Fuck
square
me.
by 2.
Oh no.
If we try and
Oh, I
compare
guess.
these two energy densities, there are some interesting things that come up. So firstly, we can see that there is a factor of half common, and we can also see that both the energy field densities, they depend on the square of the field. This one
What the fuck
depends
do we
on
do now?
the units of this would be joules per meter cube. And we have done something similar before, but for electric fields. So for that we used a capacitor, and we tried to figure out the energy of electric field, the energy density of electric field, which came out to be as epsilon naught E square by 2. If we try and compare these two energy densities, there are some interesting things that come up. So firstly, we can see that there is a factor of half common, and we can also see that both the energy field densities, they depend on the square of the field. This one depends on E square and this one depends on B square. We can also see that the constants epsilon naught, usually in all the relations in electric field, usually it comes in the denominator, comes below, but here it is upwards. And over here mu naught in magnetic field, like we can see over here and here, usually it comes in the numerator, but this is in the denominator. Also, in the case of electric field, this represents the work that the battery does to arrange the charges in some way. And in this case, it represents the work done by the battery to get a current of I going through an inductor. And it takes work because the inductor opposes the building up of current, it opposes any change. So there is some sort of a parallel between them, even from the lens of work done. And when you will study electromagnetic waves, you will realize that one is just the other. These two energy densities are exactly equal to each other. Lastly, why I feel this relation is truly special, because have a look at this. This is half into b square divided by mu naught. There is no self-inductance, there is no current. So this is a general expression of the magnetic field energy density. It doesn't matter if you take an inductor or a wire or just a bar magnet and you try to measure the magnetic field energy density created due to that. You can still rely on the same expression. It does not really depend on any source. So for instance, if you had a ball moving to the right with a velocity v and it had a kinetic energy of half mv square, it wouldn't matter whether this ball got this kinetic energy from someone who kicked this ball or the ball rolled down the hill. If you see this at one instant, it has a kinetic energy of half mv square. You do not really know what the source is, but you can still calculate the kinetic energy using this regardless of what the source is, just like over here. Also, it completely blows my mind that the energy is in the fields. Energy is in vacuum. There is nothing in the air, but there is energy present in the air because of magnetic field lines, which is just truly special for me. There are two coils A and B which are kept next to each other, and current is decreasing in coil B with time. Now we can see these two coils in front of us, and there is some current in coil B, and that is supposed to be decreasing with time. The first part is considering the effect of current induced in coil A. Will these coils attract or repel? And the second part is what is the direction of induced current in coil A.
Is white close, I guess? Well, I should have just eaten dinner. That was really stupid. Maybe I should just eat dinner now. I'm gonna make dinner. Inner. Let's go.
In this video, we're going to go over the LR circuit. In this video, we're going to go over the LR circuit. So let's work on this problem.
I just want to check.
Well, today we're 3 victories in Monument. At one point, hit mode was
A 12-volt battery is in series with a 10-ohm resistor, an open switch, and a 200 millihenry inductor. So let's draw a circuit. So here's the battery, and then here is the open switch with the resistor and the inductor. Now what we have is a 12-volt battery, and this is a 10-ohm resistor and a 200
Jag overcooked pasta.
What is the current flowing in the circuit and the 12-volt battery? And this is a 10-ohm resistor and a 200 millihenry inductor. What is the current flowing in the circuit after the switch has been closed for a long time? So at t is equal to infinity.
Is it RI squared? Damn. So it's 1.2, I guess.
The current is going to be at a maximum once we close the switch. And so that maximum current is simply the voltage of the battery divided by the resistance of the circuit. So it's going to be 12 volts divided by 10 ohms, which is 1.2 amps. So the maximum current, which I'm going to call I0, that's 1.2 amps. And so that's the answer for part A. Part B, what is the value of the time constant? The time constant is represented by the symbol tau. And to calculate it, it's equal to the inductance divided by the resistance. So the inductance is 200 millihenries, or 200 times 10 to the minus 3 henries. And the resistance is simply 10. So the time constant is 0.02 seconds, which I'm just going to rewrite this here. And so that's it for part B. Now, part C. How much current will be flowing in the circuit after 10 milliseconds? So after a time period of 10 milliseconds, what is the current? Now, 1 second is 1,000 milliseconds. So to convert 10 milliseconds to seconds, divided by 1,000. So 10 divided by 1,000 is 0.01 seconds. So now, how can we use this information to calculate the current? When the switch is closed, the current is going to increase from 0 to 1.2. And so we're going to have a graph that looks like this. So this is the current on the y-axis. On the x-axis is the time. And this is the maximum current. So that's 1.2 amps. And so it's going to start from 0 and gradually increase to its maximum value. And so that graph is represented by this formula. So the current is going to be the maximum current times 1 minus e raised to negative t divided by tau. In this
Bro, I'm really fucking bored. No fucking way. If she's already in trouble, then it was shit business.
So cute. He puts lying ahead for Deco Deco. Oh, you want to talk about Deco Deco? How about me? These tariffs. I'm like, how bad will they be? How bad will these tariffs be? Just so everybody knows, Decoden is short for Decodenois, which is a Japanese craft, which means that none of my stuff is from America. Nothing, like I literally could not find a supplier in America that wasn't just buying stuff from Asia and marking it up. So with the tariffs, I was on the phone with Caroline today, and she was explaining me these tariffs because I knew these would affect me, but I didn't know what to extent. And then I got a little anxious, and then I went online and I checked with some of my suppliers, and some of my suppliers have already pulled out of the U.S. and some of my suppliers have tripled or quadrupled their price.
Okay, never mind.
Max Verstappen has a really distinctive driving style, and it reminds me a lot of how Michael Schumacher drove. So much so that I've been comparing their onboards, and it's been super interesting. Max Verstappen drives with a Schumacher style, but one that's been adapted for the cars of now. So, let me explain. Schumacher drove with a distinctive style. He actually liked quite a lot of oversteer in his cars, meaning he liked the balance of grip in favour of the front axle. So, he would like the aero balance, the weight distribution, and the rake of the car to all favour the front, giving him incredible front end grip through the corners. This meant he could rotate the car very quickly, pivoting it in the middle of the corner. But you don't get grip for free. If you want a very pointy nose of the car, that means there's less grip on the rear. And that's what we mean by an oversteery balance. Now, this can make the car very unstable on corner entry, where it can feel like the rear axle wants to overtake you on the way in. Schumacher could deal with this, and in fact, he used it to his advantage. He used the pointy front end and loose rear end to pivot the car in the middle of the turn. But how did he do this? Well, he changed his racing line to make this work. Where many drivers were taking a wider line, sweeping through the corner to hold a high minimum speed, Schumacher did almost the opposite. He broke very late, sending the car a little bit past the apex. Then he would use his unique style to pivot the car. And then, because he had the car turned way earlier than the other drivers, he could get on the throttle not only earlier, but harder as well. And in an era where the F1 cars were very stiff and with relatively unrefined suspension, this aggressive style really worked for Michael.
The biggest variation between myself and my teammates I've had has always been how fast you go into the corner.
Let me explain a little bit more with some data. This is a telemetry trace from the hairpin at Montreal. The top graph is Schumi and the bottom is his teammate Barrichello. The red trace is the brake and the green is the throttle. As you can see, Schumacher brakes much later and much harder, showing his incredible feel for the tyre's grip. Here he must have been right on the limit of locking up. But despite braking later and gaining on entry, Michael could get the car turned and get back on the throttle earlier, carrying more speed in and out of the corner. And that is remarkable.
I have this natural ability of knowing how fast I can go into this corner without going out too often. It's an instinct.
But what's cool is that you can see it. Just look at this. Turn 1 at Hungaroring, Michael throws the car into the corner, pivoting the car and stamping on the throttle to fly back out again. Look at the steering wheel. He turns the car into the corner, then pauses on the steering. And this is when the rear of the car is sliding, just slipping exactly as Michael wants it to. And as drivers, we call this rotation. But there is another thing. Michael was left foot braking where Rubens was right foot braking, meaning that Barrichello had to hop from the throttle to the brake with the same foot, whereas Michael could actually overlap the pedals. Just look here, when Michael is braking, he's still actually on the throttle slightly, which is normally a no-no, as you're not braking to your full potential. But it's thought that Michael was actually using this to balance the car front to rear, to limit the understeer or oversteer on entry. But how does all of this apply to Verstappen? Well, we'll get to that. To analyse a driving style, I look at a lot of onboards, along with a lot of data. It helps you build up a picture of what the driver is doing and really understand their technique. And a lot like a load of other fields, you need to understand how to read data. And for a free and easy way to learn anything new with maths, computer science, look at this with Michael, that is low. He had quite an extreme style that just won't work for Verstappen. Schumacher was flying into corners, braking extremely hard and heating up the tyres a lot, then pivoting the car and sliding the rear, then smacking 700 horsepower through the rear tyres and powering out of the corner. And he did this with incredible finesse, but it's still quite an aggressive way of driving a race car. But Verstappen has been driving in an era of F1 where the tyres are just too fragile for that. If he did this, the tyres wouldn't last a lap at full pace, let alone a race distance. So, he's adapted his style. By the way, would you like the opportunity to drive
Holy
an F1
fucking
car?
shit.
Well, you can on a very harshly F1 car. Just click the link in the description. So where Schumacher V'd off a corner very harshly, pivoting the car, and Lewis Hamilton sweeps through a corner to maximise downforce, Max uses a style that is somewhere in between the two. Firstly, Max uses a very similar car setup to Michael, with a very pointy front end and a more loose rear end, but not quite as much as Schumacher. Then he uses a similar racing line, driving the car hard into the corner, but doesn't V off the corner quite as much. But why is there this difference? Well, we mentioned the tyres earlier, and they just won't deal with the sliding around, so Max just has to be more gentle with them. But there is another thing. The cars of today have much more downforce, and it's downforce that comes from the floor of the car. So you get the most out of it when the car is stable and level with the circuit. So Max drives a version of the V'd off line, but with a more open racing line. This means he can still brake late and get on the throttle early, whilst making the most of the downforce he has and protecting the tyres. There is one more crucial thing to this, and it's the reason that only a few drivers can nail this technique. And well, it comes down to something in both of these drivers. They both have an incredible natural feel for the limit of grip. With Schumacher, you could see that the car was dancing. It was always on the limit. Just look at this lap at Suzuka. He was correcting the car multiple times through each corner. When the steering wheel is dancing like that, you can tell the driver is right on the limit. And it's the same thing with Max, although you do see the steering wheel moving slightly less, as it's a newer car with more grip. But essentially the same thing is happening. You can actually see it more clearly when he's driving in changeable conditions. And we saw at Zandvoort this year, he gained 12 seconds on his teammate in just 2 laps. And with this sort of driving style that they both share, you need this ability. Anyone else who hopped in their cars might really struggle with the instability at the rear. To another driver, it would feel like the car is trying to throw them off the track. But to them, it's a dance that they're comfortable with. But there is much more to Schumacher's driving style, and I made a whole video about it just here. Thank you very much for watching, and don't forget you can still enter to win a... The current Red Bull is difficult to drive, that much is clear. But why? What is it about the car's design that makes it so hard to drive quickly? Well, I spoke to F1 aerodynamicist legend Willem Toet to explain what might be going on with the Red Bull design, and what he told me was fascinating.
Why the hell would you design a car that's that close to the edge? Well, the benefit is when you stall these little areas, unlike an aircraft wing, if you keep increasing the angle of a wing until it's stalled.
Oh, it's up? Holy shit.
Max Verstappen has been karting since he was 4 and been winning ever since. What was his driving style like, and how has it developed over the years to the point where he's won 2 world championships? Well, Max was actually driving before he was 4. His dad put him on a quad bike, and that's a key thing here. Max's dad is Jos Verstappen, an ex-F1 driver, and his mum, Sophie Kumpen, who karted with the likes of Jenson Button and Jarno Trulli. So he must have strong racing DNA, but also his dad brought him up around racing, both in the paddock of F1 tracks and at the karting circuit. So he was raised to be a winner.
He knew what went wrong in his career, and we tried to do it better now. So he was trying to make a Verstappen 2.0 really.
And you can see that. In this clip, Max is 12 years old, racing in BNL karting series, and he was incredibly quick. But how exactly was he driving? The first thing to know is that these are karts. The driving style is going to need to suit what he's driving, so it's not going to be exactly the same as he drives a Formula 1 car. But there are some clues. Just watch this. Max starts a fair way back on the grid, but is absolutely unstoppable. And even at this early age, you can see just how aggressive he is. Look at that dive bomb. A little bit of contact, but that's kind of how it's done in karting. It is super aggressive, to be fair, but you have to be at this level of karting. He makes more moves and moves up the field, but as you get towards the front of the pack, the standard of drivers is higher. And of course, they are then harder to overtake. But Max still sends it. A little more contact this time, but still harder to overtake. But the standard of drivers is higher. And of course, they are then harder to overtake. But Max still sends it. A little more contact this time, but still a fair move. Then he gets his head down and catches the pack in remarkable time, even deploying a little human DRS. Then this is the most Max move of the lot. He has the run, but is still a fair way back and dives on the brakes, braking too late, really. Just look at the understeer that he gets. But he's already compromised the other driver's racing line. He gets him back, but a lot of this is showing the other driver that you are coming through. And after a couple more corners, he gets the job done. You can see that even at 12 years old, Max is racing at a super high standard, but is still making moves and winning from the middle of the pack. And Max's karting career was remarkable, winning almost everything. He won 2 European Championships against the likes of Charles Leclerc.
A sketchy turn by Leclerc hands over the keys of the second position to Max.
Then in the World Championship, he was incredible, often leading from lights to flag. And that is remarkable because in karting, it's really hard to pull away. You often have really tight trains of karts, meaning you can never rule out a dive bomb from a kart behind. And you can start to see some of the things we see in F1 now, such as Max rarely making mistakes and being able to deliver lap after lap at an incredible pace. So here he won the race and took the World Championship, which caught the eye of several race teams. So in 2014, Max made the move to Formula 3 with Van Amersfoort Racing. And this isn't typical. Normally drivers will go to F4 or Formula Renault before making the move to F3, but Max made the jump very quickly.
I think the perfect step for me to jump in a Formula 1 car. The car is a little bit underpowered, but it's, I think, perfect to get the perfect skill.
So now Max was still very young and up against some really talented drivers. Drivers like Antonio Giovinazzi, LMP2 driver Tom Blomqvist, IndyCar driver Felix Rosenqvist, and Formula E driver Jake Dennis. But his main rival was Esteban Ocon, who was also having an incredible junior career. That year in Spa, Max made one of the most incredible overtakes I've seen from him, a proper masterpiece. Now, as promised, that overtake. Look at this, Ocon passed him before Max outbraked him and stuck it around the outside of Lecumbe. An incredibly bold move. There was so much that could go wrong here, but you can tell Max really backed himself to get the car stopped and make the move. You can also see just how intelligent Max is with his racing. Ocon made that move across to cover the inside, but he did it pretty late. Max knew that this would mean that Ocon would have to brake early, so he braked later, aiming at the outside line, and made it all the way past before the following left-hander. And it's easy to forget that at this moment, he's still only 16 years old, and already showing just how ruthless he really is. A properly formidable racer. In Formula 1, Max is famous for his driving style, but also how he likes his car set up on the nose. This means that the balance of grip focuses around the front tyres, with the car usually running the rear quite high, in order to put as much weight and therefore grip on the front of the car. This allows for a really fast turning and gives the the car an incredible ability to pivot in the corner. It just goes where Max wants it to. However, many drivers just can't handle driving in this way. Gasly and Albon at Red Bull, but also Max's dad. Max sometimes races with his dad in GT cars, and this is what Jos said.
He thinks it's too oversteery.
I need the front more stiff.
And you can see this in this clip. It's Max testing a Formula Renault. Very similar, but slightly slower than an F3 car. Now, look at the steering wheel and see how Max isn't correcting massive slides, but he is constantly balancing the car right on the limit all the way through the corner. If another driver got in that car set up in that way, I can tell you that they probably wouldn't be quite as refined. Max is driving the car completely on the edge, but is incredibly smooth. If you just look at it again, you can see his incredible feel for the grip of the tyre and how he balances the car. He's dancing it through the corner. I've coached hundreds of drivers in the past, and when I first saw the steering wheel here, I was super impressed at how incredible his natural feel is. He just isn't thinking here.
You might be thinking, hey, this motivated me, it inspired me, I was certainly motivated by this guy. But I don't want the viewers. Close to 5 million people have already watched this video.
Wait, what the fuck happened? What? Did the feds lower interest or something? Holy fuck.
To think, you know, the solution is just to run 12 miles a day, to perhaps do 3 to 5 hours of cardio. It's too much. Coach Greg in today's video, a video that you may not actually believe. calling this guy the Asian Goggins.
Stay hard, brother!
And so if you want the motivation, you want to see that you can transform your life, this is the video for you. Bro starts off 184 pounds, 27% body fat. And unlike Eddie Hall, he actually fits in the machine. And so we're going to say...
How can I see live news? Like, what the fuck is happening? Like, what? This shit is not normal, is it? Is it going back to 0? Is it, like, what? What? I don't think stocks are supposed to move like that. What?
Taking a look at two members of the Magnificent and
I guess tariffs pause. The fuck?
It's about right.
No.
Remember, Eddie Hall is one green spray tan away from starring as Shrek in a live-action reboot.
Losing weight is easy. At least that's what my doctor told me. He also told me I'm obese and pre-diabetic.
I did. didn't say it, the doctor said it. And so stop the hate. I use scientific terminology. One, he copies David Goggins' workout. It definitely worked, but at what cost? Will Tennyson once than last time. And so although it worked, I do believe he has amazing genetics for cardiovascular ability, for resilience, for dedication. Not everyone could do this challenge. In fact, almost no one could. And so Eddie Hall, you get it now why I can say he's lost 2.5 pounds of muscle, how the math checks out because it's just simple math that you learn in grade 9. But when Eddie was young, he was too busy taking steroids to have learned how to do some math. And so if you're not as dedicated to this, man, perhaps you need extra motivation. You can, of course, use balance. Balance is not about being obsessed. If you just do
If cycling is a religion in Belgium, you're welcome to...
Alright, I'm gonna head out.